everybody. So we are slowly but surely going through, and today we will have 1st and 2nd Samuel. And in our Bibles, it looks like two different books. You know, there is the first book of Samuel and there is the second book of Samuel. In reality, it's a one book. The reason why we have two of them is very, very simple and practical. They could not make scrolls in those days that would be long enough to have one book on one scroll. So that's why we have one. So it's basically Samuel part 1 and then Samuel part 2. Though technically the Samuel Samuel title as a Samuel is somewhat, like artificial. It's not the whole book is written by Samuel. We know it for sure. Because by the chapter 20, what would that be? 26, we find out, or end of 25, we find out that he dies. Okay? And then we have other prophets that kind of go in to consult David. One of them would be Nathan, very important, another important character in the life of David. But, traditionally it is still attributed mostly to Samuel, and that's how we have it. Okay? You have the structure of the book is here, and if you can see, it's not my particular design. Sometimes I do those kind of things. Sometimes I learn it from other guys who are much more smarter than me. And this one is taken from Peter Leithart's book, which is called A Son to Me. It's a commentary on the 1st and 2nd Samuel. So what we have, look at that. Birth of Samuel, and there is a song of Hannah that she sings, praising God. And then at the very end, A prime, we have a statement of David as a true king, and we have another song, and that's the Song of David. We have B's, corruption of Eli's sons, and we have rebellion of Sheba. We have another guy who is corrupted and rebels. Then C is exile and return of the ark, and we have basically almost the whole chapter 15, 16, 17, 17, 19 are describing the exile and return of David. So you can see that slowly but surely we come to the center, and the very center is where we go from one part into another one. So 28:1 of 1 Samuel going into 2 Samuel is a story of Saul's death. And another song is in the middle. So we have a song in the middle, but that song is lament. So we have a praise song in the beginning, we have a lament in the middle, and we have a confession of faith and the praise song at the very end. So now, there is an important theme. If we will talk about the 1st and 2nd Samuel as what's the main overarching idea? The main overarching idea usually is seen that we have kind of like a dismembered Republic of Israel that slowly but surely is gathered together under the rule of a king. And that good king, usually is said, is David. But the thing is, we need to understand that in the beginning, actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing what happens. The problem in Israel in the very beginning is not the fact that people are somewhat distant and apart. The problem in the beginning is the fact that the leadership, especially religious leadership, is corrupt. That's why there is so much attention to Eli's sons. And we have that as a challenge, and we overcome this challenge by preparation for the construction of the temple. So we begin with worship challenges, and we end with solving of the worship challenges. Why it is that way? Because actually the true king of Israel is God, is Yahweh. He is the one. And it's all about his power and his authority. Therefore, he rules either through the high priest or priests, or he rules through the king. But when king gets corrupt or off, he is replaced with another one. Now, so we can see the theme of rule throughout the whole book. But there is also another very important theme, and I wrote it in the notes. The theme of house. See, in English, when you hear a house, word house, you can think of a few things. You know, a building where people live, or you can think of the TV show House MD with the kind of oddball character, you know, who kind of does crazy stuff, and yet still, you know, does a great diagnostics and heals people. But that was not an advertisement. So my thing is, in Hebrew, like in many other ancient languages, words have multiple meanings. Okay? They have variety of meanings in the different areas, and the word house is one of them. Usually it is written, it's transcribed like this, so it's Beit. Or, like for example, if you go on Los Osos Valley Road and you see a Jewish place of worship, they have a Beth David, so it can be done this way. And that's also a proper name. I mean, proper transcription, I guess. So the house might mean few things. So first of all, it's a place for living. So like a building, okay? Like a home. You know, home sweet home. But not only. Another important thing is house, and especially with connection with the house of the Lord, will mean temple or a place of worship. Okay? There are a few other things. Very important part of the house idea is a family or clan. Okay? So the house of David not necessarily means the building or a palace that David built, but the house of David means his wives, unfortunately we have to put plural there, and his children, you know, boys and girls, and all the messiness they got themselves into, you know, in that thing. And therefore, it is a very dominant and prominent theme in the book. And we need to see that. Let's go to 2 Samuel 7. Usually we remember only a few verses out of that statement. That's where Lord makes the covenant with David. And we usually point out that there is a son, and God will basically adopt his son. And we know it most likely was spoken about Solomon, because he is the one who will build the house for the Lord. But before that, let's go into verses 4, 5, 6. Okay? So at the same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. And so therefore, he has a place to dwell, but he doesn't have a permanent building. He doesn't have a house. Because the whole conversation, the whole covenant situation was raised up by somewhat godly desire of David to build the temple. Okay, and first, if you remember, Nathan said, yeah, great idea, let's do it, you know. And then God appeared to him in the middle of the night and said, you know, Yes, it's a great idea, but it's not going to be done by the hands of David. So if you will read the whole conversation, the idea is, it is not you who will build me a house, meaning temple. I will build you a house, meaning family. The problem is, and that's another very important theme for the book. So there is Davidic dynasty, we'll come to that. But, I'm sorry, there is another important theme in the book that I didn't write here for whatever reason, is the seriousness that God takes when leaders are in a grave sin. Because usually when we think about David, we think about the guy who wrote Psalms. We're thinking about that it's the man after God's own heart, all of those good things. And there was this, kind of small, slip in his behavior. He kind of stumbled a little bit with Bathsheba. See, the thing is, unfortunately, it was not that small. The story of Bathsheba, usually, if you will open, please open chapter 11 and 12. That's where usually people kind of concentrate on. And that's where everything happens. Second Samuel, sorry. 2 Samuel 11 and 12, yes. 11, yes. But chapter 11 begins with a very interesting statement. Okay? Notice that it does not begin with immediately David going toward Bathsheba, which is in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon, so it's verse 2. When David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, then he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful, and we know how it goes. The problem is, again, chapter 11 does not begin with this verse. Chapter 11 begins with a very important statement. 11 verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David did not go out to the battle, but he sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. So the leader who should have been with his army, he should have been with his men, fighting and for the land, fighting for his kingdom. He sends his chief commander with guys, and he allows himself to relax and spend most of his day, not night, most of his day, laying, dreaming on the couch. Okay? So that's the beginning, and that's why the story ends, if you want to go to the very, very end of chapter 12, verse 29 and following. So David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. Okay? So then the very last verse is, and thus he did to all the cities of Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. So we kind of need to see those statements as brackets when we study those stories, that there is a bigger context. Also, because he began to mess up with the family of his people, there will be some punishment or discipline within his family. So he enters into another family, then his own family gets like this, what's that? Dismantled. Thank you. Yeah. What happens after that is in chapter 13, we find that Amnon, who was a half-brother of Tamar, attacks her and rapes her. And then her brother wants to revenge for that, so Absalom attacks him. But this is not enough for Absalom. And actually, what happens is in chapter 14 and 15, we see how Absalom tries to seize the power from his dad, from David. It forces David to run away, and there is even a period of time when Absalom rules in the kingdom, and he is actually somewhat well received by a particular group of people, but then David comes back, and Absalom ends up being he's captured by the tree. And it's very interesting that one of the great church father, John Chrysostom, when he comments on Psalm 3, you can open Psalm 3, and then when you read the subscription, you will understand why. When he comments on Psalm 3 is very interesting. So Absalom rides on his horse, and he kind of goes back, runs away from the troops that David was able to put together, and the tree with somewhat low branches caught him by the hair. So his hair got messy, and he was hanging on the branch of the tree. And now John Chrysostom, who is a church father, like a 4th, 5th century, he comments that Absalom attacked the head of the kingdom. Therefore, he died because he was caught by the head. It's like very interesting and poetic. And the reason I ask you to turn to Psalm 3 is, this is one of the few Psalms where we have historical subscription that tells us the reason for the Psalm. And the Psalm 3 is written actually when David had to run away from his own son. So let's go there. A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. And, so on and so forth. It's a very beautiful and poetic psalm, but this is one more example in the Bible where we can see how biblical authors transform their crises and their challenges into something beautiful on one hand, but it is inspired by God, and we can now use those poems or psalms that will reflect our situation. Notice that the psalm ends up not with the fact that I will overcome, I will still be in Jerusalem, I am a good guy, and so on and so forth. The psalm ends with a statement that actually, verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, and you break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Okay? So his assurance, his confidence is not on the power of his armies, is not on the power or wisdom of his chief commander leaders, but in the Lord. So salvation belongs to the Lord, and your blessing be on your people. So when we surrender, ourselves to God, so his blessing is with us. But I kind of begin with and explain kind of the second part, but we need to begin with the first part, and that's why if we'll go to the main characters, the first character that we need to pay attention is Hannah. And Hannah is a lady who is barren. Okay, and the fact of barrenness in the Bible by now, like in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is already noticeable. Usually, if somebody is noted to be barren, that means there is something wrong with the whole situation. We have at least three out of 4 matriarchs who are barren. Sarah was first barren and was able to give son to the covenantal son to Abraham only when she was 90 years old. At first, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was also said about her that she was barren. She could not conceive for about 20 years. Okay? Because we know that Isaac married when he was 40, and that when kids were born, he was 60. So for about 20 years, she was praying, she was asking for the guidance. And then the beloved wife of Jacob, he had 2 wives and 2, supporting women. What would be what?
Concubines.
Yes, and okay, whatever.
Girlfriends.
Whatever. Girlfriends? That's no. It's a little bit bigger than girlfriends. But so important thing is, we have. It's very interesting, but the names of those ladies never ever mentioned as matriarchs. Okay, so we have only Sarah, Rebecca, we have Leah, and we have Rachel. We never ever talk about was Bella and Zelpha. Okay, I don't know why. The only few times when their names are mentioned, like in the story of Joseph, for example, but not in any other given serious genealogies. But they are still there. So out of 2 wives, primary wives, Leah and Rachel, Leah, unfortunately, was not loved like Rachel, but she gave 6 kids to Jacob. And Rachel is loved, and it says, he loved her. It's a love from the first sight. They wanted to spend time together, and it's all great. But the thing is, she tried to do some tricky stuff to get pregnant, and it didn't work. Until finally she was pregnant with Joseph, and then her second pregnancy was the final pregnancy when she delivered Benjamin. So when we begin the book of Samuel with a barren woman, there is something off. There is something off. So that means there is some problem within society, and we see that. Hannah with her husband, comes to the temple. I mean, not the temple. By that time, it's still tabernacle. She comes to the place of worship. She prays, but the high priest thinks that she is drunk. So the high priest, the spirit, the guy who's supposed to be the spiritual leader of the society, doesn't know how a praying woman looks like. Okay? So that's where the crisis begins, in the house of the Lord. And that's why, as I said, if we read 1st and 2nd Samuel, the main idea is not necessarily a Davidic reign, but it's a reign of Yahweh, reign of God, or people reject his reign for one or another reason. And then we see how the son is born, and his name is Samuel. So he is the one who is asked of God, or the God heard and responded to the request. And then he is ministering together with the sons of Eli. So if you see the main characters here, that's important. Eli has at least 2 sons. And those guys are jerks, bad guys, really bad guys, because what they do is turns away people from the worship. I mean, it's bad enough that people do not really respect priesthood, but the most important thing is people are turned away from the worship of true God. And then, after the battle with Philistines, when they both die at the battlefield, and Eli dies of the heart attack because he hears the news that his sons died, Samuel kind of substitutes them. Even though he was not born in a priestly family per se, he was adopted into a family of Eli. So he succeeds the high priest, and he is the one who leads Israel for about 20 years. We need to also understand one important chronological feature. When we come to book of Judges, oops. Okay, in Judges chapters 11 and 12 that talk about Jephthah, and 13 to 16 that talk about Samson. Those chapters chronologically actually overlap with 1st and 2nd Samuel, with 1 Samuel chapters 1 to 7. Okay? That happened in the same time. So when Samson is in Philistines' temple, in the temple of the Philistines, when he destroys basically not only the temple, but with himself he destroys the leadership of Philistines. It's the same time that in chapter 7, Samuel, I know it's kind of easy to mess up because their name even not identical but sound close to each other. Okay? So when Samson destroys the leadership of Philistines, then Samuel leads the attack against Philistines, and then they break free from the 40 years of rule of Philistines. And then we have Saul. So now the question for you, and I tell you up front, a tricky question for you, is Saul a good king or a bad king?
Probably a bad one.
He was anointed
Well-
by God.
Okay,
He was God's king,
okay.
but he was a bad boy.
He's a bad guy.
The good answer would be he ended up to be a bad boy. Okay? So he begins actually as a good guy. He is the one who takes care of the flocks of his father. That's kind of surprising. It's like David who was taking care of the flocks of his father. When father asks him, he humbly does what father, asks him to do. And that's what we find in David's life. When father sends David to visit his older brothers, on the battlefield, he goes and does what father told him to do. When people approaching him to be a king, he's kind of shy and doesn't really want to do it. So he begins as a good guy, but through various temptations, he sleeps really bad, and he is a bad leader. That's why in chapter 16, so 16, we see how David is anointed. Now, there is another overlap within the book. We are still, till the very end of the 1 Samuel, we will be under the rule of Saul. Okay? But on the other hand, we already have David as an anointed king who had to hide for about 20 years. He was, hiding in different territories. At least twice he had a chance to finish Saul off. Okay? One time it was in the cave, and one time he was actually in his tent. He didn't use neither of those possibilities, which shows actually David as a good king, as a good guy, or good leader, let's put it this way, who waits patiently, then the proper opportunities for leadership would be given to him by God. Okay? That actually pushes us back into the garden, into Genesis 3. Because the whole thing with Adam is not simply trespassing the boundaries, but not waiting for the Lord that he will give the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And we know that's possible from two different statements. If you'll go with me to Genesis 3 for a second. Sorry. Let's go to, Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, we see what God tells to Adam. Verses 15, 16, and 17. The Lord took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden. Verse 17. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in that day that you will eat, you will surely die. Okay, now the question is, who heard that commandment? Adam or Adam and his wife? It's
Eve.
only Adam because his wife didn't exist yet.
Oh.
Okay? So it's Adam only who hears that there is a boundary and you need to be very careful when you approach the trees. You can eat from anything else, but not from this tree. Now, what two of them have heard? To understand that, we need to go back to chapter 1 when we see how God approaches two of them. Verse 29, or let's begin with 28. And God blessed them. So we already see Adam and Eve created. Both of them. She's not named Eve yet, she's wife. So God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you, plural, every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with the seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. So what Adam and Eve heard is every tree that has a fruit is good for food. So you somehow need to reconcile that, and the main idea that some scholars kind of contemplate, and I agree with that prohibition to reach out to the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not permanent, it was temporal. So they should have matured to live within the garden, and then God would give them, and that would lead them to live in the land. Not in the garden, but in the land. Because life in the land is somewhat more difficult than life in the garden. Okay? Because life in the garden, sweetie, I want a peach. Okay, here's a peach, I want a plum. Hey, here's the plum. How do you make bread? You don't make bread in the garden, you make bread in the land. And to make bread, you need to have seeds, you sow the seeds, you wait, you water, you take care of them, then you cut them. Then, then you grind them, then you make the flour, then you make, you mix it with water and oil, and you put it into the oven for a particular time. And if you didn't have enough time in the oven, it would be bad cake. If you had too much time in the oven, it will burn, So it takes more wisdom to handle things in the land, not in the garden. That's why we're called, kindergarten. Because kids, when they are in kindergarten, everything happens miraculously. They come and they see tables and chairs and food. Okay? They ate this food, they go to play, they come back, chairs and tables are gone, and the food is, the empty plates are somewhere else. They are washed by themselves. They have nothing to do with that. It's a garden life. It's very simple life. Life in the land is more difficult, and life in the world is even more difficult, not difficult, challenging. And life in the world is more challenging than life in the land. Okay? Because in the land, we deal with our guys. In the land, when Adam had to move outside of the garden, it's him, his wife. Then he ended up with 2 boys, apparently girls. They got married. It was one family. Okay? When we deal with the world, it's others. Those scary guys. Because you don't know what to expect from them. At least these guys are somewhat related. It's the same thing. We have a house, that's our garden. We have a church, that's our land where we deal with each other. And then we have the world outside. Okay? So that's an important paradigm that we need to kind of pick up from the Bible. So that's what happens here. And slowly but surely, we have Samuel, who deals mostly in the sanctuary, in the garden. And then we have Saul, who kind of begins to develop the land and the territories within. And then David gets in. Unfortunately, Saul had to be replaced, so David is not the one. He does deal with the world, but he mostly deals with Israel within Israel. And then Solomon is the guy who stretched the boundaries of the kingdom, not necessarily by taking the countries over, but he had influence with other lands from Ethiopia to India. Okay? Just think about that. Okay? Just think about that map. Okay? So the wisdom of God, the Word of God, was the influence of the Word of God was stretched over that magnificent land. Okay? So there is one more important thing that I would like to point out for today before we'll close is, as I said, first look at the reflections in other parts of the Bible. First and Second Samuel, in many ways, resonates with book of Exodus. So Israel goes through troublesome time, and there is a birth of special child. Okay, it's either Moses or it's Samuel, and that person will lead people into a new world, building the house of God. So either it's Samuel who goes outside, and now we are preparing to build the house of God as the temple. And in case of Moses, we are given instructions how to build the tabernacle. So we see how book kind of builds up one on another. And that's an important thing. So I gave you two memory verses. So please look them through. Any questions or comments?